Today I want to share a story that changed everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and the careful balance between love and wisdom. It's about boundaries that I should have recognized much earlier, and how sometimes the people we trust most have the greatest power to hurt us. My name is Margaret, and at 68 I've spent the last 40 years building something I was genuinely proud of, Morrison Family Trucking. What started as a single truck and a dream had grown into a fleet of 30 vehicles, serving clients across 3 states. But more than the business success, I was proud that it would continue as a family legacy. The evening that would change everything began like so many others with a family dinner that felt warm, comfortable, and filled with the kind of easy conversation that comes from years of shared history. My daughter Lisa was setting the table in my kitchen, her movements efficient and familiar. At 33, she had inherited my practical nature, though she'd chosen teaching over trucking. Her husband David was helping, as he always did, his charming smile making even mundane tasks feel lighter. David had been part of our family for 8 years, and I had genuinely grown to love him like the son I never had. At 35, he brought an energy and business sense that complemented my experience perfectly. He understood numbers, logistics, client relations, all the pieces that would be crucial for the company's future. More importantly, he seemed to understand the deeper values that had always driven the business, treating drivers fairly, maintaining relationships built on integrity, and remembering that behind every shipment was someone counting on us to deliver. "Mom, you've been putting in 12-hour days again," Lisa said as she placed the last plate. There was gentle reproach in her voice, the same tone she used with her students when they needed redirection rather than discipline. "The Hendricks contract requires some careful attention," I replied, settling into my chair. "It's a significant expansion opportunity, but the logistics are complex." David looked up from carving the roast, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Margaret, I've been thinking about that contract. With my background in supply chain management, I could take point on the implementation details, give you some breathing room to focus on the strategic relationships." This was vintage David, always looking for ways to contribute, to ease my workload, to position himself as indispensable. And honestly, it was exactly what I needed to hear. The business had grown beyond what one person could manage effectively, and I wasn't getting any younger. "The succession planning can't wait much longer," I admitted, accepting the plate he handed me. "Dr. Peterson has been not so subtly suggesting I should consider reducing my stress levels." Lisa's fork paused midway to her mouth. "What did he say exactly?" "Nothing dramatic. Blood pressure running a little high, sleep patterns not what they should be. The usual warnings that come with ignoring your body for 40 years. I smiled to soften the concern I saw in her eyes. "He's right, of course. I need to start transitioning some responsibilities." David set down his own fork, his expression serious. "I want you to know, Margaret, that whatever you decide about the company's future, I'm committed to honoring everything you've built, the values, the relationships, the reputation. All of it matters to me as much as it does to you." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the practiced charm he used with clients. This was family conversation, real and unguarded. "I know you are, David. That's why I've been thinking about accelerating the timeline for bringing you into a more formal leadership role." Lisa reached across to squeeze my hand. "Mom, you don't have to decide everything tonight, but I'm glad you're finally acknowledging that you can't carry it all alone forever." "Actually," David said, his tone casual, but his eyes focused, "I've been researching some of the legal structures we'd need for a smooth transition. There are tax advantages to acting sooner rather than later, and some liability protections that could benefit everyone." I nodded, appreciating his thoroughness. "I'd like to see what you found. Maybe we could meet with Harrison next week." Harrison Mitchell had been the company's attorney for 15 years, a steady presence through expansions, contract negotiations, and the occasional legal complexity that came with any growing business. "Absolutely. I'll put together a presentation of the options." David's enthusiasm was infectious. I've also been thinking about some operational improvements that could increase efficiency by 15 to 20% within the first year. This was why I trusted him with the company's future. David didn't just see the immediate opportunity. He saw the potential for growth, for improvement, for building something even better than what existed. His business degree from State, combined with 8 years of observing our operations, had given him insights that I valued deeply. As we finished dinner, the conversation drifted to lighter topics: Lisa's school year, David's weekend plans to help his brother move, my upcoming coffee date with Eleanor from the church auxiliary. Normal family rhythms that felt comfortable and secure. I should probably head home soon, I said as Lisa began clearing dishes. Early morning tomorrow, and I want to review the Hendricks proposal one more time before the call. Mom, Lisa said, loading the dishwasher with the efficiency of someone who had learned to multitask out of necessity. You know you can trust David and me to handle more of this, right? We're not asking you to step aside completely, but you don't have to micromanage every detail. David dried his hands and turned to face me fully. Lisa's right, Margaret. I understand the company means everything to you. It represents decades of your life, your independence, your legacy. But part of building something lasting is knowing when to let others carry it forward. The wisdom in his words struck me. At 68, I was still trying to handle every decision, review every contract, approve every significant expense. It wasn't sustainable, and more importantly, it wasn't fair to the people I was supposedly preparing to take over. You're both right, I admitted. I suppose old habits die hard. When you've been making every decision for 40 years, it's difficult to trust that anyone else will care as much as you do. But that's exactly the point, David said gently. I do care as much as you do. This isn't just a business opportunity for me, Margaret. It's family. It's legacy. It's the chance to continue something meaningful, rather than just starting something new. As I drove home that evening, David's words echoed in my mind. The careful balance between maintaining control and allowing growth. Between protecting what I'd built and trusting others to build upon it. The autumn air was crisp through my slightly open window, and the familiar streets of our small town felt particularly comforting. What I didn't know, as I pulled into my driveway and prepared for what I assumed would be another routine evening of document review, was that David's words about caring as much as I did would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. Sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers who wish us harm, but from those we trust most completely, and sometimes the boundaries we most need to establish are with the people we never thought we'd need to protect ourselves from. The foundation of trust I thought was unshakable was about to reveal cracks I never saw coming. 2 weeks after that dinner conversation, I was driving back from what should have been a routine appointment with Dr. Peterson. The news wasn't terrible. My blood pressure was manageable with medication, and his recommendations about stress reduction were sensible if predictable. But as I turned onto my street, something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was David's truck in my driveway. That wasn't unusual. He often stopped by to discuss business matters or help with maintenance projects. But there was something else. Something that made my stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the car door. Smoke, not the pleasant smell of a fireplace or burning leaves, but the acrid, chemical smell of something that shouldn't be burning. I rushed to the front door, my keys fumbling in my suddenly unsteady hands. David, I called out as I entered the house. Margaret. His voice came from the direction of my home office, and there was something in his tone, relief, concern, that I couldn't quite identify. Thank God you're back. I've been trying to call you. I hurried down the hallway toward the office that had served as my business command center for the past 15 years. The smell grew stronger with each step, and when I reached the doorway, I stopped completely. The room was destroyed, not ransacked, not burglarized, destroyed. My filing cabinets were blackened hulks of twisted metal. The desk where I'd reviewed thousands of contracts was a charred skeleton. Papers, decades of carefully organized documents were scattered across the floor in various stages of destruction, some reduced to ash, others partially burned and illegible. What happened? The words came out as barely a whisper. David appeared beside me, his face a picture of concern and exhaustion. His clothes were dirty, his hands showed minor burns, and there was genuine distress in his eyes. "Electrical fire," he said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Started in the wall behind your filing cabinet. By the time I smelled smoke and got back here, it had spread to most of the documents." I stepped into the room, my legs feeling unsteady. The contracts, the client files, the succession planning documents we've been working on. "I know. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I tried to save what I could." He gestured to a small pile of water-damaged papers on what remained of my desk. "The fire department said I shouldn't have gone back in, but I couldn't just let everything burn." The heroic gesture should have touched me. David had risked his safety to save my life's work. But as I looked around the destroyed room, questions began forming that I didn't want to ask. "Where were you when it started?" I heard myself saying. "I'd just arrived to pick up the Henderson contract files you mentioned yesterday. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I smelled smoke." His story was delivered smoothly, with the kind of detail that suggested either truth or careful preparation. I knelt beside the pile of salvaged documents, my hands shaking as I tried to assess what remained. The Henderson files were there, though water-damaged. A few insurance policies, some correspondence with clients. But the critical documents, the detailed succession plans, the financial records dating back 20 years, the contracts that formed the foundation of our client relationships, all of it was gone. "The fire department?" I asked, standing up slowly. "They left about an hour ago. Said it was definitely electrical, probably old wiring that finally gave out. These older houses, you know." David's explanation was reasonable, logical even. Our house was built in 1987, and electrical problems weren't uncommon in homes that age. But something was nagging at me, a small voice in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite silence. "The backup files in the safe." David's expression grew even more apologetic. "The heat damage was extensive. The safe held, but the temperature inside, ... He shook his head. "I think we lost those too. Everything. 40 years of business records, client relationships, financial history, legal documents, all of it reduced to ash and twisted metal." The weight of the loss was beginning to settle on me like a physical presence, making it hard to breathe. "Margaret, I know this is devastating," David said, his voice gentle but determined. "But I want you to know that I remember most of the critical information. The client relationships, the contract terms, the operational details. We can rebuild this." There it was again, that small voice, questioning something I couldn't quite identify. Why was David so quick to position himself as the solution? Why did his offer to rebuild feel more like an opportunity than a tragedy? "I should call Harrison," I said, referring to our attorney. "He'll have copies of some of the legal documents." "Already thought of that," David replied quickly. "I called his office from the hospital. Unfortunately, their policy is to keep copies for 7 years, and most of our foundational agreements are older than that. But he's willing to meet with us tomorrow to discuss reconstruction options." The efficiency of his response should have reassured me. Instead, it deepened the unease I was trying to ignore. David had thought of everything, contacted everyone, positioned himself as the person with all the answers. It was helpful. It was thorough. It was exactly what someone would do if they were trying to control the narrative from the very beginning. Lisa arrived 20 minutes later, having received David's call about the fire. She hugged me tightly, her teacher's instincts kicking in as she guided me to the kitchen and began making tea with the same calm efficiency she brought to classroom crises. "Mom, are you okay? Really okay?" she asked, studying my face with the attention that came from 33 years of reading my moods. "I'm processing," I admitted. "It's a lot to take in." David had been on the phone with our insurance company, and he returned to the kitchen with updates that were both helpful and somehow troubling. "They'll send an adjuster tomorrow, but the agent said electrical fires are usually straightforward claims. We should be able to get started on restoration fairly quickly." "What about the business impact?" Lisa asked, "Won't losing all those records create problems with clients?" "Some complications, certainly," David acknowledged. "But I've been working closely with Margaret for years. I know the key relationships, the pricing structures, the operational requirements. We can reach out to clients directly, explain the situation, and work with them to reconstruct the essential agreements." Again, the solution-oriented response that should have been comforting, but felt somehow opportunistic. As if David had been waiting for exactly this kind of crisis to demonstrate his indispensability. "I think I need to lie down," I said. The emotional and physical exhaustion finally overwhelming my ability to process everything analytically. Lisa helped me to my bedroom, her movements gentle but her eyes sharp with concern. "Mom, is there anything about this that's bothering you? Besides the obvious, I mean." I looked at my daughter, this woman who had inherited my intuition, along with my stubbornness, and realized I wasn't ready to voice the doubts that were forming. They seemed unfair, ungrateful even. David had risked his safety to save what he could. He was offering to help rebuild what was lost. He was handling the practical details, while I struggled with the emotional impact. But something felt wrong. "I just need some time to absorb this," I told her. "It's not just the documents. It's 40 years of history, gone in an afternoon." Lisa squeezed my hand. "We'll figure this out together, Mom. David's right that a lot of this can be reconstructed. And maybe this is an opportunity to modernize some of the systems anyway." After Lisa and David left, I sat in my bedroom trying to make sense of the emotions churning inside me. Grief, certainly. Anger at the unfairness of it all. Gratitude for David's help. But underneath it all was something else. Something that felt like suspicion even though I had no logical reason for it. The timing was convenient for David's desire to take on more responsibility. The destruction was complete enough to eliminate any documents that might complicate a succession plan. His solutions were ready almost before the problems were fully understood. I told myself I was being paranoid, that trauma and loss were making me see conspiracies where there were only coincidences. David was family. He loved Lisa. He had invested 8 years in building relationships with our clients and employees. He had everything to gain from the company's continued success and nothing to gain from its destruction. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and smelling the lingering smoke that seemed to permeate everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Not just the loss of documents, but something deeper about the dynamics of trust and power in relationships I had thought were completely secure. Sometimes the greatest violations happen not through dramatic confrontations, but through small shifts in circumstance that change everything while appearing to change nothing at all. And sometimes, the people we trust most completely are the ones best positioned to exploit that trust when it serves their purposes. I was beginning to understand that boundaries aren't just about saying no to obvious threats. They're also about recognizing when the people closest to us have incentives that may not align with our own well-being, even when their actions appear helpful, even when their intentions seem pure. The real fire, I was starting to suspect, wasn't the one that had destroyed my office. It was the one that was about to consume the foundation of trust I had built my family relationships upon. 3 days after the fire, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Harrison Mitchell's office and requested a private meeting without David, despite his assumption that he would be involved in all business discussions moving forward. "Margaret," Harrison said as I settled into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. "David filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened." I appreciated Harrison's directness. At 62, he had the kind of practiced neutrality that came from decades of helping families navigate complex situations without taking sides prematurely. "That's actually why I wanted to meet alone first," I said. "I have some concerns I need to discuss confidentially." His expression shifted to the careful attention reserved for sensitive matters. "What kind of concerns?" "The timing of this fire feels convenient for David's interests. The completeness of the destruction eliminates documentation that might complicate his assumption of control. His readiness with solutions suggests he may have been planning for this scenario. I paused, hearing how my words sounded when spoken aloud. I realized that might sound paranoid. It sounds careful, Harrison corrected. And given what's at stake, careful is appropriate. Tell me specifically what's bothering you about his response. I outlined the details that had been nagging at me. David's immediate presence at the house. His comprehensive contact with relevant parties before I even knew about the fire. His smooth explanations for why backup systems had also failed. His quick positioning as the person with all the answers. What do you know about the actual cause of the fire? Harrison asked. David says the fire department confirmed it was electrical. Old wiring, inevitable failure. I hesitated. I haven't spoken to them directly. Harrison made a note. We should verify that independently. What about the insurance aspects? David handled that communication too. Says it should be a straightforward claim for electrical fire damage. Another pause. Harrison, does any of this seem suspicious to you, or am I letting grief and shock cloud my judgment? Both things can be true, he said diplomatically. Your concerns deserve investigation regardless of their ultimate validity. Even if David is completely innocent of any wrongdoing, you need confidence in that conclusion before moving forward with succession planning. The relief I felt at having my suspicions taken seriously was immediate and overwhelming. What would you recommend? Several steps. First, I'll contact the fire department directly and request a copy of their report. Second, we should have an independent fire investigation if their conclusions seem inadequate. Third, let's review what legal protections exist for your interests, regardless of the fire's cause. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Margaret, there's something else we should discuss. When David called my office, he asked about expediting the succession planning documents to take advantage of what he called a clean slate opportunity. Those were his exact words. The phrase sent a chill through me. Clean slate opportunity. He suggested that rebuilding the documentation from scratch would allow for more streamlined legal structures and updated dollars agreements that would be more tax efficient and operationally efficient. Efficient for whom? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. That's exactly the question we need to explore. Harrison pulled out a legal pad. Tell me about the backup systems you had in place. Were the destroyed documents really the only copies of critical information? Here was where I had to make a choice about how much to reveal. The truth was more complex than David realized, and certainly more complex than I had let on during our family discussions. Harrison, I said carefully, I've been in business for 40 years. I learned early that the most important rule is to trust but verify, and to always have contingency plans that don't depend on other people's good intentions. His eyebrows raised slightly. Meaning I have backup systems that David doesn't know about. Complete backup systems. The silence that followed was charged with implications. Harrison set down his pen and looked at me directly. How complete? Every document that was in my office exists in digital form, in a secure cloud storage system that I set up 3 years ago. Every contract, every financial record, every piece of correspondence, every legal document, all of it. David doesn't know about this. No one knows about this except you, as of right now. I learned a long time ago that the best backup plans are the ones that can't be compromised by the people you're backing up against. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Margaret, if you have all the documents, why haven't you said anything? Because I want to understand what David is really doing before I show my hand. If he's innocent, then I've been harboring unfair suspicions about someone I love. If he's not innocent, then I need to understand the full scope of his plan before I react. And if he's not innocent, I met his eyes steadily. Then I need to protect myself and the company in ways that ensure he can never try something like this again. Harrison made several notes, his expression growing more serious with each line. There's something else you should know. David also asked about the legal requirements for having someone declared incompetent to manage their business affairs. The words hit like a physical blow. He what? He framed it as a hypothetical, said he was concerned about the stress of the fire affecting your judgment, and wanted to understand what protections existed for family members who might need to step in temporarily. The scope of what David might be planning was becoming clearer, and it was more sophisticated than I had initially suspected. Not just opportunism around a convenient fire, but potentially a comprehensive plan to remove me from control of my own company. Harrison, I need you to do something for me. My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. I need you to help me gather information about David's activities without him knowing we're investigating. What kind of information? Financial records, communications, any documentation of his planning activities. I also need to understand the legal implications of what he's suggested to you. I paused, and I need to know if there are any other factors I should be aware of. Margaret, this kind of investigation could damage family relationships irreparably if your suspicions prove unfounded, and not investigating could cost me everything I've built if my suspicions prove accurate. The choice was stark but clear. Harrison, in your professional opinion, do my concerns warrant this level of scrutiny? He was quiet for several minutes, reviewing his notes and considering the implications. Yes, he said finally. They do. David's combination of convenient presence, comprehensive solutions, and questions about competency proceedings suggests either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate planning. Either way, you need to know which it is before making any major decisions about the company's future. There's one more thing, I said. I've been recording conversations with David for the past year. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. You've been recording him. Why? Business instincts. Something about his eagerness to take control felt too intense, too impatient. I started keeping digital records of our discussions about company matters. I pulled out my phone, including several conversations where he expressed frustration about my pace of succession planning, and suggested that waiting for me to be ready might not be the best strategy for the company's future. Do you have his consent for these recordings? Wisconsin is a one-party consent state. As long as I'm part of the conversation, the recordings are legal. I had researched this carefully when I started the practice. Harrison, I think David has been planning to remove me from my own company for months, possibly longer. The fire just accelerated his timeline. If that's true, then we're not just talking about family betrayal. We're potentially talking about fraud, possibly arson, and definitely a conspiracy to illegally transfer assets. The weight of the situation was settling on both of us. What had started as vague suspicions about convenient timing was evolving into evidence of a comprehensive plan to steal my life's work. What's our next step? I asked. We build a case methodically and carefully. We verify the fire investigation. We analyze David's communications and activities. We document everything we discover, and we prepare for multiple possible outcomes. Harrison's tone was grave. Margaret, if your suspicions are correct, David is intelligent and organized enough to be genuinely dangerous. We need to be smarter than he is. And if my suspicions are wrong, then we'll have satisfied ourselves that the person you're trusting with your life's work is worthy of that trust, and you can move forward with confidence. As I left Harrison's office that afternoon, I felt the strange combination of relief and dread that comes with finally acknowledging that a situation you hoped was imaginary is actually real. The investigation that would either exonerate David or expose him was now officially underway. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The sharp focus that comes with recognizing you're in a fight for everything that matters to you. I had built Morrison Family Trucking from nothing, had survived recessions and market changes and every other challenge the business world had thrown at me. If David thought he could steal it from me through manipulation and destruction, he was about to learn that 40 years of business survival had taught me skills he couldn't imagine. The real battle was just beginning, and this time, I would be ready for it. Harrison's call came exactly 1 week after our private meeting, and his tone immediately told me that my worst suspicions were about to be confirmed. Margaret, we need to meet immediately, and this time, you might want to consider bringing someone you trust for emotional support. I arrived at his office 30 minutes later, my hands steadier than I had expected them to be. Sometimes when you've been dreading confirmation of something terrible, the actual moment brings clarity rather than panic. The fire investigation report, Harrison said without preamble, sliding a folder across his desk. The fire department's conclusion was electrical failure, but when I pressed for details, they admitted their investigation was cursory. David had convinced them that a more thorough investigation would be unnecessary and potentially damaging to the family's privacy. David convinced them. He presented himself as your business partner and primary advocate, suggested that extensive investigation would just prolong your trauma unnecessarily. Harrison's expression was grim. I had an independent fire investigator review the scene yesterday. Margaret, this was not an electrical fire. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I had known, on some level, but hearing it confirmed was still devastating. What was it? Accelerant-based fire, specifically designed to target paper documents while making the damage appear electrical. The investigator found chemical residue that wouldn't be present in a genuine electrical fire, and burn patterns that indicate intentional placement of accelerant. Harrison opened the folder to show me photographs I didn't want to see. This was arson, carefully planned and expertly executed. The betrayal was complete, but there was something else in Harrison's expression that suggested worse news was coming. That's not all, he continued. David has been more active than we realized. He's had preliminary conversations with 3 of our major clients, allegedly to reassure them about business continuity following your fire trauma. In each case, he positioned himself as the logical successor and suggested that your ability to manage the company moving forward might be compromised. He's been undermining me to our clients. More than undermining, he's been laying groundwork for what appears to be a complete takeover. Harrison pulled out another folder. He's also been in contact with 2 different law firms about competency proceedings and emergency business guardianship orders. The scope of David's planning was becoming clear, and it was far more comprehensive than I had imagined. This wasn't opportunism around a convenient fire. This was a calculated campaign to remove me from my own company. Harrison, there's something I haven't told you. I took a deep breath. The cloud backup of all my documents isn't the only precaution I've taken. What do you mean? I mean that if David has been planning this for months, I've been unconsciously preparing for it for years. I pulled out my phone. I've been recording not just our business conversations, but many of our family conversations, including several where he discussed strategies for accelerating my retirement that didn't depend on my consent. Harrison's eyebrows rose. How many recordings? Dozens. Dating back 18 months, including conversations with Lisa where he discussed the possibility of having me declared incompetent if I continued to resist succession planning. He discussed this with your daughter. Not directly, but he's been gradually introducing the idea that my attachment to controlling every aspect of the business might indicate cognitive decline. He's been very subtle about it, very careful to frame his concerns as loving worry rather than impatience. Harrison was making notes rapidly. Margaret, these recordings could be crucial evidence if David follows through on his plans. But they also indicate that this conspiracy goes deeper than we initially thought. It gets worse, I said. 3 days ago, I discovered that David has been systematically photographing documents in my home office for at least 6 months. I found evidence of this in the metadata of some files on his laptop that Lisa mentioned he'd been working on at home. He was copying your business documents, apparently preparing for either legitimate succession or illegitimate takeover, depending on how cooperative I proved to be. The calculating nature of David's preparation was becoming clear. Harrison, I think the fire was Plan B. Plan A was to convince me to retire voluntarily. When that didn't work fast enough, he moved to Plan B, and Plan C. Based on his questions to you about competency proceedings, Plan C is to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs. I met Harrison's eyes. The question is whether we let him get that far. Harrison set down his pen and looked at me directly. Margaret, What you're describing is a comprehensive conspiracy involving fraud, arson, and potentially elder abuse. If we're going to proceed, we need to be absolutely certain of our evidence, and absolutely committed to seeing this through to whatever conclusion the facts lead us to. I'm certain, and I'm committed. My voice was steady, but I need to understand something first. How sophisticated is David's planning? Because if he's been preparing for this as long as I think he has, he probably has contingencies we haven't considered. That's exactly what concerns me, Harrison admitted. The level of preparation you're describing suggests someone who has thought through multiple scenarios and prepared for various forms of resistance. Over the next hour, Harrison and I analyzed what we knew about David's activities. The picture that emerged was disturbing in its comprehensiveness. David hadn't just been planning to take over the company. He had been building a legal and social foundation for claiming that such a takeover was necessary for my own protection. The conversations with your clients were particularly strategic, Harrison noted. He didn't directly criticize your competence, but he consistently raised concerns about your stress levels, your resistance to modernizing operations, and your difficulty accepting help with management responsibilities. Building a narrative that I'm becoming incapable of managing the business. Exactly. And if he can combine that narrative with evidence of erratic behavior following the fire, he has the foundation for a competency challenge that might succeed. The realization hit me like ice water. Harrison, what if the fire wasn't just about destroying documents? What if it was also about creating a crisis that would make me appear unstable or incompetent in my response? Harrison was quiet for a long moment. That would be extraordinarily calculating, but not impossible for someone who has been planning this comprehensively. I thought through the implications. If I had reacted to the fire with visible panic, or if I had made obviously poor business decisions in the aftermath, it would support his narrative about my declining capabilities. The fact that you didn't react that way might have forced him to accelerate his timeline, Harrison said thoughtfully. Which could work to our advantage. How? Because accelerated timelines create opportunities for mistakes. And if David is as calculating as we think he is, he's probably been very careful up to this point. But if he feels pressured to move faster than planned, he might expose himself in ways he hasn't anticipated. Harrison opened his calendar. Margaret, I'm going to suggest something that might sound counterintuitive. I think we should let David proceed with his plans, at least initially. What do you mean? I mean we should act as though we don't suspect anything while we gather comprehensive evidence of his activities. Let him think his plan is working while we document everything he does. You want me to pretend to be the victim he thinks I am? I want you to appear vulnerable enough that he feels confident proceeding, while actually being prepared enough to destroy him when he shows his hand completely. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my meeting with Harrison. David's voice was urgent but controlled, with the tone he used when he needed to appear concerned rather than excited. Margaret, I've scheduled an emergency meeting with Harrison for this afternoon. We need to discuss some urgent legal matters regarding the company. What kind of urgent matters? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Some complications have arisen with the insurance claim, and there are client concerns that need immediate attention. His pause was perfectly timed. I think it would be best if Lisa joined us as well. This affects the whole family. The trap was being set, exactly as Harrison had predicted. David was moving to his endgame, and he wanted witnesses present who would later testify about my supposed inability to handle the situation appropriately. Of course, I said, allowing a slight tremor into my voice. Should I be worried? Let's just discuss everything this afternoon. Harrison will explain the legal implications better than I can. What David didn't know was that Harrison and I had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Every document was ready, every piece of evidence was organized, and every legal strategy was mapped out for multiple scenarios. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Harrison's conference room. I arrived first, as planned, to review our final preparations. Are you ready for this? Harrison asked. I've been ready for this my whole life, I replied. I just didn't know it until now. David and Lisa arrived together, and I could see immediately that Lisa was confused about why she had been asked to attend. David, on the other hand, had the focused energy of someone implementing a plan he had rehearsed extensively. "Thank you all for coming," Harrison began with appropriate solemnity. "David has raised some concerns about the business situation that we need to address comprehensively." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Margaret, I've been trying to protect you from some difficult realities, but the situation has reached a point where we can't delay action any longer." "What situation?" Lisa asked, clearly unaware of whatever David thought was happening. "The insurance company has raised questions about the fire that could jeopardize the claim," David said smoothly. "They're suggesting the possibility of fraud, which could have serious legal and financial implications for your mother." The lie was delivered with complete conviction. David had spent weeks building toward this moment, and his performance was flawless. "Fraud," I said, allowing shock and confusion to color my voice. "What kind of fraud?" "They think someone with access to the building might have deliberately started the fire to destroy evidence of financial irregularities." David's tone was carefully neutral, as if he were simply reporting unfortunate facts rather than orchestrating them. Lisa turned to me, her face pale. "Mom, what is he talking about?" "I don't understand," I said. Which was true in the sense that I didn't understand how David could deliver such calculated lies to people who loved him. Harrison consulted his notes with the grave expression of someone delivering bad news. "The insurance company has also questioned some of the financial records that were destroyed in the fire. They're suggesting there may have been irregularities that would have been discovered in a routine audit." This was the heart of David's strategy. He had spent months setting up a narrative where I appeared to be hiding financial problems that the fire had conveniently destroyed evidence of. The insurance fraud accusation provided legal pressure, while the suggestion of previous financial irregularities undermined my credibility and competence. "What kind of irregularities?" Lisa demanded. David pulled out a folder with the same careful preparation he brought to every aspect of his plan. "There are discrepancies in client payments, unexplained transfers between accounts, and some contracts that don't match the terms your mother discussed with me." Each accusation was carefully crafted to be difficult to disprove given that the supposed evidence had been destroyed in the fire. David had spent months learning enough about the business to construct plausible-sounding problems that would justify urgent intervention. "Margaret," Harrison said with appropriately professional concern, "these allegations are serious enough that we need to consider immediate steps to protect both you and the business." "What kind of steps?" I asked, continuing to play the confused victim while mentally preparing for David's ultimate revelation. Given the potential legal exposure and the complexity of managing these problems while dealing with the trauma of the fire, David said, his voice gentle but firm, "I think we need to consider transferring operational control of the company temporarily, until these issues can be resolved." There it was. The moment David had been building toward for months, possibly years. He had created a crisis that only he could solve, evidence that only he could interpret, and a situation that required immediate action to protect everyone involved. "Transfer control to whom?" Lisa asked, though the answer was obvious. "To me," David said with precisely the right combination of reluctance and determination. "I know it's not ideal, but I'm the only person who understands the business well enough to navigate these legal complications while protecting Margaret's interests." Lisa looked between David and me, clearly struggling to process what was happening. "Mom, what do you think about this?" This was the moment I had been preparing for. The moment when I would either submit to David's manipulation or reveal that I had been several steps ahead of him the entire time. "I think," I said, my voice suddenly steady and clear, "that David has created an impressive fictional crisis to justify stealing my company." The silence that followed was electric. David's expression shifted from concerned sympathy to barely controlled alarm in the space of a heartbeat. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I think the stress of everything that's happened might be affecting your judgment." "No, David, my judgment is perfectly clear." I turned to Harrison. Would you please explain to David and Lisa what we've discovered about the real cause of the fire? Harrison opened a different folder, one that David hadn't seen before. The independent fire investigation conclusively determined that the fire was caused by accelerant, not electrical failure. The burn patterns and chemical residue are consistent with deliberate arson designed to target paper documents. Lisa gasped. David's face went completely white. Furthermore, Harrison continued, we have documented evidence of David's communications with clients designed to undermine Margaret's credibility. His inquiries about competency proceedings, and his systematic preparation for assuming control of the business. That's not David started, but Harrison cut him off. We also have digital evidence of David photographing business documents in Margaret's home office for months prior to the fire, suggesting premeditation for either the fire itself or the subsequent fraud allegations. David looked frantically between Lisa and me, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing in real time. This is insane. Margaret, you're having some kind of breakdown. Lisa, you can see that, right? But Lisa was staring at her husband with an expression I had never seen before. The look of someone recognizing a stranger wearing a familiar face. David, she said slowly, did you burn down my mother's office? Of course not. This is all some paranoid conspiracy theory brought on by trauma and stress. David was losing the controlled composure that had served him so well throughout his manipulation campaign. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone. We have recordings of you discussing your frustration with my resistance to succession planning and your belief that more aggressive measures might be necessary. The color drained from David's face completely. You've been recording our private conversations. Our business conversations, yes. Including several where you expressed the opinion that waiting for my voluntary retirement might not be the best strategy for accessing control of the company. Harrison placed another document on the table. We also have evidence of David's inquiries about insurance policies, emergency guardianship procedures, and the specific legal requirements for having someone declared incompetent to manage their own affairs. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a setup. You've been planning this to make me look guilty. No, David, I said, standing as well. You've been planning to steal my company, and we've been documenting your plan as you implemented it. Lisa was staring at her husband with growing horror. David, just tell me the truth. Did you start that fire? For a moment, David's mask slipped completely, and I saw the cold calculation that had been hidden beneath months of performed concern and family loyalty. Your mother is an old woman who can't accept reality, he said with sudden viciousness. She's been holding back the company's potential for years with her paranoid control issues and her refusal to modernize. I've been trying to help her transition gracefully, but she's too stubborn and suspicious to accept help. By burning down her office. Lisa's voice was rising. By doing whatever was necessary to prevent her from destroying everything I've worked to build. David's composure was completely gone now. I've spent 8 years learning that business. Building relationships with those clients, developing strategies for growth that she's to set in her ways to implement. The company would be worth twice as much if she would just get out of the way. The confession was more complete than I had dared hope for. David had revealed not just his actions, but his motivations, his sense of entitlement, and his complete lack of remorse for the destruction he had caused. So you decided to remove her from her own company through fraud and arson. Harrison's voice was perfectly calm, but I could see he was recording every word. I decided to save the company from being destroyed by an old woman's ego. David snapped. Margaret built something valuable, but she's too selfish to let anyone else take it to the next level. Lisa stood up slowly, her face pale but her voice steady. Get out. Lisa, you don't understand what's really happening here. I understand that my husband is a criminal who tried to steal my mother's life's work. Lisa's teacher voice had never been more authoritative. Get out of this office, and get out of my life. David looked around the room, finally understanding that his plan had not just failed, but had destroyed everything he had claimed to be protecting. This isn't over, he said, his voice tight with anger and desperation. Actually, Harrison said, pulling out one final document, it is. These are criminal charges for arson, fraud, and conspiracy. The police are waiting outside to escort you from the building. As David was led away in handcuffs, Lisa collapsed into her chair, shaking with the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Mom, she said through tears, how long have you known? I've suspected for weeks, I admitted. But I needed to be certain, and I needed him to reveal the full scope of his plan before we acted. I can't believe I brought him into our family. I can't believe I trusted him with everything that mattered to us. I reached across to take her hand. David was very good at being who we needed him to be. That's what made him dangerous, but it's also what allowed us to catch him. His confidence in his own manipulation made him careless about evidence. Harrison was organizing documents with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had just achieved a complete victory. Margaret, the evidence we've gathered should ensure that David faces appropriate consequences for every law he's broken and every boundary he's violated. As we left the office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, complete clarity about who could be trusted and why. The boundaries that had been violated were now re-established more strongly than ever. The company that had been threatened was now protected, and the family relationships that had been manipulated were now based on truth rather than deception. David had taught me that even the people closest to us can become threats when their interests diverge from our well-being. But he had also taught me that careful preparation, strategic thinking, and the courage to act on evidence rather than emotion could protect everything that mattered most. The legal battle was won. But the deeper victory was in understanding that boundaries aren't walls that separate us from people we love. They're foundations that ensure the people we trust are worthy of that trust. Just when I thought the nightmare was over, Harrison called with news that sent my world spinning again. Margaret, we have a problem. David's attorney has filed an emergency motion claiming that the recordings were obtained illegally, and that the entire case against him is based on entrapment. But Wisconsin is a one-party consent state, I protested. It is, but they're arguing that since you recorded him under false pretenses, specifically, while pretending to be confused and vulnerable, the recordings constitute fraud on your part. Harrison's voice was tense. They're also claiming that your elaborate performance of incompetence was designed to induce him to make statements he wouldn't have made otherwise. The irony was staggering. David's attorney was essentially arguing that I had been too competent in documenting his crimes, and that my competence invalidated the evidence of his incompetence claims against me. What does this mean for the criminal charges? If the judge accepts their argument, most of our evidence could be thrown out. David could walk away with minimal consequences, and depending on how aggressively they pursue their counterclaims, you could face charges for fraud and entrapment. The chess game that I thought had ended was continuing in ways I hadn't anticipated. David might be more sophisticated than even I had given him credit for. There's more, Harrison continued. David's attorney is demanding access to all your digital records to verify the authenticity of the cloud backup. They're claiming that if you were sophisticated enough to entrap David, you were sophisticated enough to fabricate evidence. Can they do that? A judge could order it. Yes. And Margaret, there's something else you need to know. David has provided them with evidence that you've been experiencing memory problems for months. What kind of evidence? Statements from Lisa about conversations where you seemed confused. Documentation of times when you forgot business appointments. Records of instances where you asked the same questions multiple times. Harrison paused. They're building a case that your competence has been declining, which would support David's original claims about needing to intervene for your protection. The revelation hit me like ice water. David hadn't just been planning to steal my company. He had been systematically creating evidence to support his narrative about my declining competence, even as he was being recorded confessing his actual crimes. Harrison, was Lisa really telling David about my memory problems, or was David manipulating her into creating those statements? That's what we need to find out. Because if David was deliberately creating situations to make you appear confused, and then documenting your confusion, he's been building his defense strategy from the very beginning. Over the next 2 days, Harrison and I reviewed every interaction I'd had with David over the past year, looking for patterns of manipulation designed to create evidence of confusion or incompetence. What we found was chilling in its sophistication. David had been consistently asking me to repeat information I had already provided, then expressing concern to Lisa about my repetition. He had been scheduling meetings and then changing them at the last minute, then documenting my confusion about the timing. He had been asking complex questions about business operations when I was tired or distracted, then noting instances where my answers weren't immediately comprehensive. He was manufacturing evidence of incompetence while simultaneously planning to create situations that would require competence proceedings. Harrison realized, this isn't just theft. It's systematic psychological manipulation designed to create legal justification for the theft. How do we prove that? We need to demonstrate the pattern, and we need to show that David's behavior changed after he began planning his takeover. Harrison was making notes rapidly. Margaret, I need you to think carefully about when David's behavior toward you shifted. When did he start asking repeated questions? When did he begin expressing concerns about your memory to Lisa? As I reviewed the timeline, a pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than I had realized. David's campaign to undermine my competence had begun almost immediately after his business degree graduation 3 years ago. The progression had been subtle but systematic, first establishing himself as indispensable, then gradually creating situations that made me appear less capable, then positioning himself as the solution to problems he was creating. Harrison, I think David has been planning this for 3 years. 3 years. The recordings I have go back 18 months, but the pattern of manufactured confusion goes back to when he finished his business degree. I was starting to see the full scope of David's strategy. I think completing his education gave him the confidence to believe he could manage the company better than I could, and the knowledge to understand how to legally remove me from control. If that's true, then the fire wasn't plan B, it was always part of a comprehensive strategy. The next morning brought Harrison's call with news that would change everything again. Margaret, David's attorney made a mistake. In their motion to suppress the recordings, they included documentation that they claimed proved David's concerns about your competence were legitimate and long-standing. What kind of documentation? Digital records showing that David had been researching competency proceedings and emergency guardianship orders for over 2 years. Harrison's voice carried barely controlled excitement. They were trying to prove that his concerns were genuine rather than opportunistic, but they accidentally provided evidence that his planning was far more extensive than we had realized. How does that help us? Because it proves premeditation on a scale that transforms this from opportunistic fraud to long-term conspiracy. David wasn't reacting to your declining competence. He was planning to create the appearance of declining competence to justify removing you from your own company. The legal strategy was becoming clear. David's attorney had tried to prove that his client's concerns were legitimate by demonstrating how long-standing they were. Instead, they had proven that David had been planning to steal my company for years, regardless of my actual competence. What's our next move? We present our own timeline showing that David's research into competency proceedings began before any legitimate signs of confusion on your part, and that his systematic creation of confused situations followed a pattern consistent with deliberate manipulation rather than genuine concern. That afternoon, Harrison and I met with the prosecutor handling David's criminal case. The evidence we presented painted a picture of manipulation that was breathtaking in its scope and chilling in its calculation. David hadn't just been planning to steal my company. He had been systematically undermining my confidence, creating evidence of confusion, positioning himself as indispensable, and building legal justification for his takeover. The fire was just one element in a years-long campaign designed to transfer control of everything I had built to someone who felt entitled to it. The recordings aren't entrapment, the prosecutor concluded after reviewing everything. They're documentation of ongoing criminal activity. The fact that Margaret was sophisticated enough to recognize and document the manipulation doesn't invalidate the evidence of the manipulation itself. What about David's claims that she induced him to make statements he wouldn't have made otherwise? His statements were consistent with behavior he had been engaging in for years. Margaret's performance didn't create his criminal intent. It revealed criminal intent that already existed. As we left the prosecutor's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this entire ordeal began: confidence that justice would be served appropriately. David's sophistication had ultimately worked against him. His careful planning provided evidence of premeditation. His systematic approach demonstrated that this wasn't impulse or desperation, but calculated predation. But more than that, I felt a deep satisfaction in understanding that the skills I had developed over 40 years of business management, strategic thinking, careful documentation, patience in developing comprehensive responses to complex problems, had been exactly what was needed to protect everything I had built. David had underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible. He had assumed that because I trusted him, I was naive about the world. He had confused my willingness to include him in family decisions with inability to recognize when those decisions were being manipulated. The student had indeed become the teacher, but the lesson was still being delivered. David was about to learn that the boundaries he had violated weren't just personal preferences or family dynamics. They were principles that, when violated systematically and comprehensively, carried consequences that would reshape his entire life. The ultimate revelation wasn't just that David had planned to steal my company for years. It was that in trying to prove he was more sophisticated than a 68-year-old woman, he had provided evidence that would ensure he faced the full weight of justice for every law he had broken and every trust he had betrayed. The final act was approaching, and this time, I was certain of the outcome. 6 months after David's arrest, I sat in a courtroom watching justice unfold, with the methodical precision I had hoped for but hadn't dared expect. The judge's voice was clear and measured as he delivered the sentence. "Mr. David Chen, you have been found guilty of arson in the first degree, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted elder abuse. The court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and orders full restitution for damages caused." 8 years. It seemed both significant and insufficient for someone who had spent 3 years systematically planning to steal my life's work. But as I watched David's shoulders slump in defeat, I realized that the real victory wasn't in the length of his sentence. It was in the comprehensive dismantling of every manipulation he had attempted. The evidence had been overwhelming. Harrison's careful documentation, combined with my recordings and the independent fire investigation, had painted a picture of premeditation that David's sophisticated attorney couldn't dismiss or explain away. More damaging than any single piece of evidence was the timeline showing 3 years of systematic preparation for what David had tried to present as a spontaneous response to family crisis. Lisa sat beside me, her hand resting on mine with the quiet strength that had emerged from this ordeal. The past 6 months had been brutal for her, discovering that her husband was a criminal, facing the reality that her marriage had been built on deception, rebuilding her life as a single mother. But she had navigated it all with the same practical competence she brought to managing a classroom full of challenging students. "Mom," she whispered as the bailiff led David away, "are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I replied, and realized I meant it completely. The business had not just survived David's attack. It had emerged stronger. The clients he had tried to undermine with suggestions about my competence had rallied around the company when they learned the truth. Several had actually increased their contracts, impressed by the strategic thinking and careful preparation that had exposed David's plan. "Mrs. Morrison," the prosecutor said as we gathered our belongings, "I want you to know that this case will be studied in law schools. The level of documentation you maintained and the strategic patience you showed in gathering evidence set a new standard for protecting businesses from internal threats." The praise was gratifying. But what mattered more was knowing that Morrison Family Trucking would continue as the family legacy I had always intended it to be. Lisa had decided to take a more active role in the business, not because she felt obligated to replace David, but because she had discovered genuine interest in the strategic challenges of logistics and client relationships. I never realized how much psychology was involved in business management, she had told me a few weeks earlier. Understanding people's motivations. Building trust while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Reading situations for what they really are rather than what they appear to be. It's like classroom management, but with higher stakes. Harrison joined us as we left the courthouse, his satisfaction evident in his relaxed posture and genuine smile. Margaret, I have to admit, when you first came to me with suspicions about David, I thought you might be letting grief and shock cloud your judgment. And now I understand that 40 years of business survival taught you to recognize patterns that someone like me, who has spent his career in law rather than entrepreneurship, might have missed. He shook his head admiringly. Your instincts were not just right. They were strategically brilliant. The three of us went to lunch at the small restaurant where Lisa and I had been having monthly dinners for years. It felt like reclaiming normal life, but with a deeper appreciation for the security that comes from relationships built on truth rather than manipulation. Mom, can I ask you something? Lisa said as we settled into our familiar booth. Always. When did you know for certain that David was planning something? Was there a specific moment when you stopped trusting him? I considered the question carefully. There wasn't one moment. It was a gradual recognition that his eagerness to help was becoming more about control than support. His solutions were always ready too quickly. His explanations were always too comprehensive. His positioning as indispensable was too convenient. But you let him think you trusted him completely, because the only way to stop someone who is systematically manipulating you is to understand the full scope of their manipulation before you react. If I had confronted David based on early suspicions, he would have adjusted his strategy and become more careful. By allowing him to believe his plan was working, we gathered evidence of everything he was actually doing. Lisa nodded slowly. It's like dealing with a student who is cheating. If you accuse them based on one suspicious test, they just get better at hiding it. But if you document patterns over time, you can address the real problem instead of just the symptoms. Exactly. David's crime wasn't just the fire or the fraud. It was the systematic violation of trust and family relationships for personal gain. To address that comprehensively, we needed evidence of the pattern, not just individual incidents. As we finished lunch, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've protected not just your own interests, but principles that matter beyond personal circumstances. David's prosecution had established legal precedent for recognizing systematic manipulation as elder abuse. Even when the victim is competent and capable of self-protection. What happens now? Lisa asked as we prepared to leave. Now we continue building something worth protecting, I replied. The company grows. Our family relationships are based on truth and choice, rather than obligation and manipulation. And we remember that boundaries aren't walls that separate us from people we love. They're foundations that ensure the people we trust are worthy of that trust. Over the following months, I implemented changes in the business that reflected everything I had learned about recognizing and preventing internal threats. Employee background checks became more comprehensive. Financial controls were strengthened. Documentation requirements were enhanced. Most importantly, succession planning was restructured to include multiple safeguards against any single person gaining disproportionate control without appropriate oversight. Lisa's involvement in the business brought fresh perspectives on everything from technology integration to employee development. She had inherited my strategic thinking abilities, but she approached problems with the collaborative instincts of someone trained in education rather than the more solitary decision-making that had characterized my management style. You know, Mom, she said one afternoon as we reviewed quarterly reports together, David actually did us a favor in a weird way. How do you figure that? He forced us to examine every assumption we had about trust, family, and business relationships. The systems we've put in place now are stronger than anything we had before. The company is more resilient, our family dynamics are more honest, And I understand the business in ways I never would have if everything had proceeded normally. She was right. David's attack had revealed vulnerabilities in our systems and relationships that needed to be addressed. His systematic manipulation had taught us to recognize patterns that might protect us from future threats. His betrayal had clarified what we truly valued and why it was worth protecting. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from David in prison. He wanted to apologize, to explain his actions, to somehow repair the relationships he had destroyed. I read it once, then filed it away without responding. Some boundaries, once violated comprehensively, cannot be restored. David had demonstrated over 3 years that his primary loyalty was to his own advancement rather than to family relationships or ethical business practices. No apology could change that fundamental revelation about his character. But more importantly, I had learned that protecting yourself from people who violate boundaries doesn't require you to hate them or seek ongoing punishment. It simply requires you to remember who they really are and make decisions based on evidence rather than hope. Lisa married again 2 years later, to a man whose respect for her independence and family relationships was evident from their first meeting. She had learned to recognize manipulation techniques and to establish clear boundaries from the beginning of relationships, rather than hoping problems would resolve themselves over time. The business continued to grow, eventually expanding into 3 additional states and becoming the regional logistics company I had always believed it could be. Lisa took over as CEO on my 70th birthday, not because I was forced to retire, but because I chose to transition to an advisory role while I was still healthy enough to enjoy other interests. David was released after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence. I heard through Harrison that he had moved to another state and was working in an entry-level logistics job for a small company. I hoped he had learned something about the difference between earning success and stealing it, but I didn't invest any energy in finding out. The most important lesson from this entire experience wasn't about recognizing criminals or preventing fraud. It was about understanding that boundaries in relationships aren't restrictions on love, they're expressions of love. When we allow people to violate our boundaries without consequences, we enable them to become worse versions of themselves. David didn't become a criminal overnight. He became a criminal through a series of small compromises with his own integrity, each one justified by his belief that his goals were more important than the methods he used to achieve them. If I had established clearer boundaries earlier, about respect for my decision-making timeline, about appropriate roles in family business discussions, about the difference between helpful input and manipulative pressure, David might never have progressed to criminal behavior, or he might have revealed his true character sooner. Before he had invested years in building the foundation for systematic betrayal, the woman I am today understands something the woman I was 3 years ago didn't fully grasp. Love without boundaries isn't really love. It's enablement that allows people to avoid the consequences of their choices and prevents them from developing genuine character. Lisa learned this lesson more quickly than I did, probably because she saw the devastating effects of enabling behavior played out in real time. Her new husband, Marcus, appreciated her independence and decision-making abilities rather than trying to gradually undermine them. He supported her career advancement rather than positioning himself as more capable. He contributed to family discussions rather than controlling them. The difference, Lisa told me one evening as we watched Marcus teaching her children to ride bikes with the patient enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed their success, is that Marcus wants me to be the best version of myself. David wanted me to be the version of myself that was most useful to him. That distinction between people who support your growth and people who try to control your growth became central to how I evaluated all relationships moving forward. Harrison remained our family attorney, but our relationship had evolved into something closer to friendship. His meticulous approach to legal protection had saved not just my business, but had established precedents that would help other families facing similar threats. "Margaret," he said during one of our quarterly business reviews, "I've had 3 other cases this year involving family members attempting sophisticated financial manipulation of elderly relatives. In each case, We were able to apply strategies we developed during your situation. Are you saying that David's case is helping other families? I'm saying that your willingness to document everything systematically and to pursue justice comprehensively has created tools that protect other people from similar attacks. Harrison smiled. Your strategic patience is still paying dividends beyond your own situation. The legacy aspect of this experience, the possibility that our careful response to David's manipulation might protect other families, added meaning to what had initially felt like pure victimization. On my 72nd birthday, as I watched 3 generations of family and friends celebrate in the backyard of the home that David had tried to destroy, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from his betrayal. I had learned to trust my instincts about people's motivations rather than dismissing suspicions as uncharitable. I had developed systematic approaches to documentation and boundary setting that protected relationships without restricting them. I had discovered that strategic thinking applied to personal relationships could be as effective as strategic thinking applied to business challenges. Most importantly, I had learned that surviving sophisticated manipulation isn't about being suspicious of everyone. It's about being clear about your own values and boundaries, and responding appropriately when those boundaries are violated, regardless of who is violating them. Lisa brought me a piece of birthday cake and settled into the chair beside me. Mom, do you ever regret how we handled the David situation? Do you wish we had tried to resolve things within the family instead of involving lawyers and prosecutors? It was a question I had asked myself many times over the past few years. No, I said after considering carefully. David's actions weren't family problems that could be resolved through conversation and compromise. They were criminal violations that required legal consequences. Treating crimes as family disputes enables the criminal behavior and teaches everyone involved that serious violations of trust don't have serious consequences. But it destroyed my marriage. David destroyed your marriage when he decided to steal from your mother for 3 years while lying to you about his motivations and activities. We just documented the destruction that had already occurred. Lisa nodded slowly. I think I needed to hear that again. Sometimes I still feel guilty about not trying harder to save the relationship. The relationship that existed between you and David was based on his deception about who he really was and what he really wanted. You can't save a relationship with someone who doesn't actually exist. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you've handled a major life challenge with integrity and wisdom. David's attempt to steal my life's work had ultimately strengthened everything he had tried to destroy. The business was more successful and more secure than ever. My relationship with Lisa was deeper and more honest than it had ever been. My understanding of how to protect what matters most was comprehensive enough to guide me through whatever challenges might emerge in the future. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that boundaries aren't barriers to relationships. They're the foundation that makes genuine relationships possible. When people know where the lines are and understand that violating them has real consequences, they're free to build trust within those boundaries rather than constantly testing them. David taught me that even people we love completely can become dangerous when their interests diverge from our well-being. But he also taught me that careful preparation, strategic documentation, and the courage to act on evidence rather than hope can protect everything that truly matters. The boundaries I maintain today aren't defensive walls built out of suspicion and fear. They're clear expressions of what I value and what behavior I will accept from people who want to be part of my life. They allow me to love generously without enabling harmful behavior, to trust appropriately without being naive about people's capacity for self-interested decision-making. As I locked the front door that night, I looked around at the home that David had tried to use as a symbol of my vulnerability and incompetence. It stood instead as proof that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from avoiding all threats, but from recognizing them clearly and responding to them comprehensively. The woman David had tried to victimize no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that the best protection against manipulation isn't suspicion or isolation. It's clarity about your own worth, strategic thinking about relationship dynamics, and the wisdom to know that boundaries maintained with love and consistency create the foundation for relationships that honor everyone involved. Morrison Family Trucking would continue for generations. Not because I had avoided all threats to its existence, but because I had learned to recognize and respond to those threats in ways that strengthened, rather than diminished everything we were building together. The most important lesson wasn't about business or family or legal strategy. It was about understanding that protecting what you love sometimes requires you to stop people you love from destroying it, even when stopping them means they face consequences they never intended to accept. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. And sometimes, wisdom is the most loving thing you can offer to a world that desperately needs people who understand the difference.